From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Wednesday, May 20th, 2015. History professor Peter Kuznick reflects on the 70th anniversary of the U.S. bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Norwegian psychologist Per Espen Stoknes joins us to discuss his new book, What We Think About When We Try Not to Think About Global Warming. That's coming up today after the news. Joining us now to analyze breaking news headlines is Cristina Mislan, Assistant Professor of Journalism Studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Cristina.
Hello, Sonali.
An 11-mile underground oil pipeline near Santa Barbara has burst, releasing an estimated 21,000 gallons of crude oil into the ocean and covering about 50 yards of water from the beach. The spill was first detected when a woman smelled fumes and reported them, after which the Coast Guard managed to stop the flow of oil. The pipeline is operated and owned by Plains All-American Pipeline, which has issued an apology. The area that the spill occurred in is home to many species of wildlife, including a number of species of whales. In 1969, an oil spill in the same area, which at that time was the largest ever to be such a spill, helped to kickstart the local environmental movement. Meanwhile, Shell Oil, which has faced a slew of protests in the Seattle area in recent days, also faced anger from its own shareholders. In its annual meeting yesterday, Shell has pledged to combat climate change, and its shareholders want to hold the company to that promise. Cristina, is this Santa Barbara spill yet another indication that the fossil fuel industry is just too dangerous to humans and the planet?
I definitely think it's one event out of many in the past decade or so, or maybe even longer, that continue to force us to have to search and think about what are we going to do, right, in searching for alternative energy sources. That's super important. I imagine that there are many people out there who don't believe that the fossil fuel industry is impacting them, but, you know, as recent catastrophic events, they tell us otherwise. And so even organizations that I often critique, for instance, the World Bank, even those kinds of organizations are warning us about the world warming at an alarming rate. You know, this fossil fuel industry is an industry that receives approximately $500 billion in annual subsidies. And so taxpayers are indirectly, around the world, are indirectly paying for the destruction of the earth, and we don't even realize it.
And then the Federal Trade Commission has just filed a major lawsuit that is the equivalent of a bombshell on the world of nonprofit charities. The government agency has accused 4 major cancer charities of, quote, outright lies, saying that, quote, the defendants told donors their money would help cancer patients, including children and women suffering from breast cancer, but the overwhelming majority of donations benefited only the perpetrators, their families and friends and fundraisers, end of quote. Staff and employees of the charities apparently purchased cars and took luxury cruises with donor money. The legal complaint contends that the charities, quote, operated as personal fiefdoms, characterized by rampant nepotism, flagrant conflicts of interest, and excessive insider compensation. The 4 nonprofit groups are the Cancer Fund of America, Cancer Support Services, Children's Cancer Fund of America, and the Breast Cancer Society. The FTC has filed a suit in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. Cristina, the story really shocked me, both in the accusations that the FTC makes and the fact that it filed this very strongly worded lawsuit. What is your reaction?
Yeah, well, and I think many people will find this news shocking, but the truth is that this isn't really a new story, unfortunately. And so when I read it, I thought, oh, yes, of course. I immediately thought of other nonprofit organizations, like, for instance, the American Cancer Society. So even bigger, more well-known charity nonprofit organizations have come also under increasing scrutiny. And so, for instance, over the last 2 decades, if we think about just a huge organization like the American Cancer Society, the budget comes from large corporations, pharmaceutical, cancer drug, the telecommunications, entertainment industries. So even you're not even just talking about the way in which donations are used. You're also talking about the interest that are involved in these nonprofit organizations and how they operate. So the foundation's board of the trustees includes, for the American Cancer Society, for instance, corporate executives. And so the bottom line is that maybe we need to start rethinking and redefining what it is that we mean by charity, and maybe move away from this idea of just donating money, right? Find actually ways where we can get personally involved ourselves. It's easy to donate. It's much harder to use our own energy for much needed services. And it's also important to do research about the organizations that we want to donate to if that's what we want to do.
Right. And finally, Los Angeles yesterday became the largest U.S. city to adopt a plan to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. The LA City Council voted 14-1 to raise the current base wage of $9 an hour to $15 by the year 2020. The increase will be phased in over a 5-year period, allowing businesses with fewer than 25 workers an extra year to catch up. The decision is expected to reverberate around the nation, where the call for $15 an hour is becoming the new norm. Adding to the growing demand for economic justice, presidential candidate Senator Bernie Sanders has just released a proposed bill that would fund public higher education through Wall Street transaction fees, effectively making college free. At a press conference yesterday, Sanders said, quote, "It is a national disgrace that hundreds of thousands of Americans today do not go to college, not because they are unqualified, but because they cannot afford it." Cristina, could we be getting closer to a world where debt-free college graduates are able to earn at least $15 an hour and actually live decent lives? Or is that too optimistic?
Honestly, I have to say we might be a little too optimistic here. I can definitely see us moving toward actually having living wages for people. I think that's definitely realistic and in our near future. Free college tuition, though, is another issue. As someone who works within the academic institution, and many other scholars have also critiqued the academy, the academy works in many ways that are very much similar to corporate institutions. The money universities receive from tuition, alumni, sports, research allow the university to run much like a business. And in fact, some universities, if not many, hire lobbyists to do their bidding in Washington. So there's a corporate mentality running even in public universities. This isn't just the Ivy Leagues. This isn't just private universities or the so-called nonprofit kind of universities, right? Or for-profit universities, I should say. It's really about, there's all kinds of politics and interests that are going to prevent any attempt to make tuition free for everyone.
Cristina, thank you as always for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
Cristina Mislan is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Did you know that Uprising is now a TV show? It was just about a year ago that we campaigned to launch a TV show of Uprising, and just about 8 months since we actually began broadcasting on television. And it, of course, airs on Free Speech TV, which you can get via Dish Network or DirecTV. But if you don't have either of those, you can also subscribe to Uprising's YouTube channel. And it's a very small monthly fee that helps us sustain the TV production of Uprising. You can find it all at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. It was not long ago that the specter of mutual nuclear annihilation overwhelmed global discourse, and brinksmanship was all that remained between survival and mass extinction. But in all of history, the U.S. has been the only nation to actually deploy nuclear weapons. In fact, this August marks the 70th anniversary of the U.S. bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We turn today to Peter Kuznick, a professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. He's also the author of Beyond the Laboratory, Scientists as Political Activists in 1930s America, published by the University of Chicago Press. And he's the co-author with Akira Kimura of Rethinking the Atomic Bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japanese and American Perspectives. Peter Kuznick has collaborated with acclaimed and award-winning filmmaker Oliver Stone to co-author a 12-part Showtime documentary film series and a book, both titled The Untold History of the United States. Here is a recent interview that I did with Peter Kuznick. Now, of course, this year, as I said, is the 70th anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, and the U.S. has been the only country to drop, and in that case, 2 bombs, over 100,000 people killed, and the fallout, continues. How did that horror change the course of history, and how do you respond to those who still defend it, saying that had we not killed that many people at the time, we would have risked killing far more, and it was that which ended the war, etc.?
This is one of the things that we go into great detail on in our Untold History of the United States. It's a very important issue that I've been writing about for 2 decades now. The reality was that the atomic bombs, the excuse that was used by American officials, Stimson and others who wrote about this, and Truman's statements, was that we dropped the atomic bombs in order to avoid an invasion. That the United States was going to have to invade Japan. The invasion, Truman writes in his memoirs that Marshall told him it would cost 500,000 American lives. Stimson talks about 1 million American casualties. That's the myth. The reality was that the United States knew that Japanese were already defeated, that the Japanese were trying to get better surrender terms, including keeping the emperor, that the thing that the Japanese feared the most was the Soviet invasion, that they wrote about this repeatedly, that the Soviets were due to invade in early August. And so, and what finally ends the war is not the atomic bombing, it's the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. As the Japanese prime minister says, tomorrow they'll be in Hokkaido. Japan, the essence of Japan will be destroyed. We have to surrender now before we have to the Americans before we surrender to the Soviets, and the Soviets take over Japan. So that was the thinking of the Japanese at the time. The Americans knew that. Truman knew that. It's explicit in our policy statements that the thing that the Japanese fear the most is the Soviet invasion. The Soviet invasion will convince Japan that further resistance is unnecessary, that defeat is inevitable. And the Japanese knew that. So the other thing about the atomic bombing, the United States had already proven that it could wipe out Japanese cities. We firebombed over 100 Japanese cities. Destruction reached 99.5% in the city of Toyama. The Japanese leaders had accepted that the United States could wipe out cities. The big issue to them was not whether it was 1 plane and 1 bomb or 200 planes and thousands of bombs. It was the fact that they accepted we could wipe out cities. So the atomic bombings, in that sense, didn't change the equation. What did change the equation was the Soviet invasion. Now that undermined Japan's military strategy, its Ketsuga military strategy. It undermined its diplomatic strategy because they've been trying to get the Soviets to intervene to get them better surrender terms, to get them to keep the emperor, essentially. Most Americans don't realize that 6 of America's 7 5-star admirals and generals who got their 5th star during the war are on record as saying the atomic bombs were either militarily unnecessary, morally reprehensible, or in many cases, both. So we're talking about MacArthur, we're talking about Eisenhower, we're talking about Leahy, we're talking about the top Japanese leaders.
Now, Peter, how did the legacy of those bombings change Japan's own approach to war? I mean, you would think that it would have changed the U.S.'s approach to one of never again, since our government was the one that actually perpetrated these. But, of course, we have kept our imperialism strong, and it was really Japan who changed the way it approached the whole world in terms of foreign policy.
Interestingly enough, it was during the U.S. occupation, and it was MacArthur and his staff who helped draft Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which makes Japan having a peace constitution, Article 9 says the Japanese nation renounces the use of war as a tool of foreign policy or even the threat of war. So Japan becomes the most peaceful nation in the world. It says we can't maintain offensive nuclear forces, and Japan holds on to that view. In fact, the Japanese people embraced it. During the Korean War, the United States had second thoughts and wanted to change the Japanese constitution so that Japan could help with the United States in Korea. However, the Japanese people and their leaders resisted American pressure to change the peace constitution. Unfortunately, now the Abe administration, an extreme right-wing nationalist administration that runs Japan, is trying to change Article 9. They've already supported collective self-defense. They're now trying to officially undo Article 9 so that Japan can maintain offensive military forces and work with the United States in many parts of the world. Sadly, it was Obama who helped put Abe into power. The Japanese Democratic Party was elected, and Hatoyama was elected on basically a peace platform to a large extent, but one of the fundamental issues was that he was opposed to the relocation of the U.S. Marine base from Futenma to Hinoko on Okinawa, and Obama insisted that they relocate the Marine base to Hinoko, as the previous government had agreed to, and Obama came in there and smashed Hatoyama, effectively undermined his credibility, forced him to capitulate to the United States, and then that leads to the weakness of the Japan Democratic Party and return to power of the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, the conservative forces, who Obama was sadly much more comfortable in dealing with. And that's what got us this right-wing Abe administration in Japan.
Right, which is now turning back some of the aspects of the peace constitution. But I'm glad you brought up Obama, because when President Obama became president initially, he started his early years as wanting to draw down nuclear weapons around the world and the stockpiles. He made a major speech, and it really heartened a lot of anti-nuclear activists. What happened to that? We hardly ever hear about it anymore.
Obama's Prague speech was actually a very, very positive statement, and he called for eliminating nuclear weapons, abolishing nuclear weapons. But even in that speech, you hear him hedging. He says it may not happen in my lifetime, certainly not in his administration. And he also effectively says that the United States is not going to be the first country to do away with its nuclear arsenal. The United States is going to be the last country to do away with its nuclear arsenal. So we had some hints there that Obama was stating a certain principle, but we were optimistic partly because Obama seemed to really believe this. Most people don't remember that Obama marched in Central Park in 1982 in that huge anti-nuclear march. 1 million people demonstrated in New York in 1982 for a nuclear freeze and eventually abolition of nuclear weapons. Obama was one of them. So there was reason to assume that in this, Obama was sincere. But like in everything, or most everything else, Obama was a disappointment. And he capitulated to the more conservative voices around him, the hawkish voices, the Hillary Clintons, the other supporters, the Jones and other supporters he had, because he surrounded himself with these militarists as his advisors. And if you look now, Obama is supporting the modernization of America's nuclear forces, a policy that is going to cost $1 trillion over the next 30 years, the next 3 decades. And this is Obama's policy. So instead of doing away with nuclear weapons, as was required by the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the 1968 treaty, it said that the 5 nuclear powers, the acknowledged nuclear powers then, had to move toward getting rid of their nuclear stockpiles. The United States and the others have maintained their nuclear stockpiles. And the Marshall Islands, of all countries, is suing now an international court in order to try to get the nuclear powers to agree to follow through on their commitments back in 1968.
Now, Peter, there have not been that many figures historically in U.S. politics who had the courage to openly denounce the pursuit of nuclear weapons and, at least during the Cold War, want to, openly end it. And one of the people who did fulfill that description that you and Oliver Stone write about in your book and feature in your film was Henry Wallace, Vice President of the U.S. along FDR for his first term, went on to be replaced by Truman only months before FDR died. And you've written much about this chapter in U.S. history in terms of what might have been had Wallace remained FDR's running mate. How progressive was Wallace, both in the issue of war but also social issues?
Wallace, sadly, is forgotten by most Americans today. Wallace was a visionary figure. He was Roosevelt's Secretary of Agriculture during the New Deal. In 1940, when Roosevelt was running for a third term, he wanted a real progressive on the ticket because he knew we were heading toward a war against fascism and militarism, and he chose Henry Wallace over the objections of the party bosses who were going to get their revenge back in 1944, 4 years later. And Wallace, as vice president, was a great visionary. When Henry Luce makes his speech saying the 20th century should be the American century, the United States should dominate the world, Wallace followed that up and challenged Luce, and he says it shouldn't be the American century, but it's the century of the common man in the tradition of the American, the French, the Latin Americans, and the Russian revolutions. He calls for a worldwide people's revolution. And he says that we have to end monopolies, end cartels, end colonialism, end exploitation, spread the fruits of science and technology around the world. And so in 44, when he was running again, he had a lot of enemies. The British and the French put pressure on Roosevelt to get him off the ticket because he's a leading spokesman against colonialism. The Southern conservatives and segregationists hated him because he's a leading spokesperson for black civil rights. The business community hated him because he was a leading spokesperson for labor. He had denounced America's fascists. He said, with those people who think Wall Street comes first and the American people second. The conservatives hated him, and they waged his campaign within the Democratic Party through the party bosses to get rid of Wallace on the 1944 ticket. Despite that, Wallace almost prevailed anyway because he was the second most popular man in the United States behind Roosevelt. The day that the Democratic Convention began in Chicago, July 20th, 1944, Gallup released a poll showing that 65% of American voters said they wanted Wallace back on the ticket as vice president. 2% said they wanted Harry Truman. So the party bosses had to control the convention, engineer this coup, basically, to get Wallace off the ticket and Truman on. Truman was a basic non-entity. He had been ridiculed as a senator from Pendergast, this corrupt political machine. He was not a major player. He was not in any way knowledgeable about these issues, but the bosses thought he was pliable and he would do their bidding. So they tried to get him on the ticket. In the midst of a spontaneous demonstration for Wallace, Senator Claude Pepper fights his way through the crowd. He knew that if he could get Wallace's name and nomination that first night, Wallace would sweep the convention, be back on the ticket as vice president, and then he would have been the one to become president on April 12, 1945, when Roosevelt died, instead of Truman.
And then who knows what kind of a country we might have been living in at that time and maybe even through today.
Yeah, it could have been fundamentally, dramatically different. It would have been a battle on Wallace's part, but he was a fighter, a man of great vision and great principle. He stays on in the cabinet under Truman as secretary, well, first under Roosevelt, and then stays on for a year under Truman as Secretary of Commerce. And from that position, he wages a battle against the Cold War, and he's the leading spokesperson for the abolition of nuclear weapons. So he maintained those principles, and he would argue with Truman and convince Truman. The problem with Truman was he wasn't a committed war hawk in the sense he was not a genocidal maniac in some crazy sense. Truman was a decent guy with very little knowledge, very little backbone, who would replace reason with bluster because he realized how little he himself understood. And he surrounded himself with these hacks, the people who Roosevelt would never have turned to for advice on foreign policy. And these people were hardline anti-communists, very conservative, much more militaristic, and they pushed Truman in a direction that he was willing to go. And finally, in September of '46, he fires Wallace from the cabinet. And then the last voice against the Cold War, the last voice for nuclear disarmament is out of the cabinet. By that point, Wallace was the last of the old New Dealers who was still in an influential position. Truman had replaced them all.
Well, Peter Kuznick, I want to thank you so much for helping us shine a light on these historical events and their relevance to what's happening today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
My guest, Peter Kuznick, is a professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. He's the author of Beyond the Laboratory, Scientists as Political Activists in 1930s America, co-author with Akira Kimura of Rethinking the Atomic Bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japanese and American Perspectives. And of course, he's collaborated with filmmaker Oliver Stone to co-author a 12-part Showtime documentary film series and book that are both titled The Untold History of the United States. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. The warming of our planet is unarguably the greatest existential threat facing the human species, and for that matter, most other species. The release of greenhouse gas emissions into our atmosphere has had predictable results. Extreme weather is more common, and the specter of runaway warming is quite real. Each week, a new study warning of the catastrophic impacts of climate change haunts us. But strangely, public opinion about the reality of climate change is quite out of step with the overwhelming evidence. In fact, it almost appears as though the more evidence there is, the more denial there is. Addressing that bizarre conundrum is my guest, Per Espen Stoknes, a psychologist specializing in climate and environmental strategies, economic psychology, and energy systems. He is the author of the new book, What We Think About When We Try Not to Think About Global Warming, Toward a New Psychology of Climate Action. Welcome to Uprising, Per Espen.
Great to be with you, Sonali.
Thanks so much for joining us. Now, first, can you tell us about your own background? How have you been involved in the fight for climate justice, and for how long?
I started out somewhat more than 20 years ago as I came into collaboration with the Norwegian eco-philosopher and founder of deep ecology, Arne Næss. And I found my background in Jungian psychology very compatible with eco-philosophy. So I introduced eco-psychology to the Norwegian society.
So you're from Norway, you're currently visiting the United States. The US is, of course, a very important place in the conversation around climate change, is it not?
It absolutely is. This is where the action is going to be, really. And that's why I published in the US this time.
And also, not only do we have an outsized footprint when it comes to the production of greenhouse gas emissions, we also have an outsized footprint when it comes to the influence on popular culture worldwide, for good or ill.
Absolutely. So I think the US also has an outside position when it comes to the opportunities of turning the energy system in the world around. So it's very, very important to the world what's happening in the America right now.
Now, how has the sort of conversation around climate change, as it comes from scientists, possibly contributed to the way in which people think about climate change, and sometimes even the denialism? I mean, scientists are doing the frontline work in establishing the evidence, but they're not always the best communicators, are they?
No, unfortunately not. My work starts with a mystery, so to speak, of the psychological climate paradox, which is that over the previous decades, the more scientific facts and information that has been spread out, the less concern we've seen in Western wealthy democracies. And on average, more people were concerned about climate change in 1989 than there are today.
What do you
it's kind of obvious now that understanding human responses to climate change is clearly becoming just as important as understanding climate change itself.
Now, you write in your book that the human brain is not even that capable of addressing or accepting these huge existential threats? I mean, how limited are we just in terms of our brain's capability of understanding these giant threats?
It really depends on how we use our brain, because our brain is a fantastic, amazing organ and has its surprising ways. However, if we just let it go on by itself, so to speak, and also particularly when it meets the large and very abstract threat of climate, then a series of quite peculiar psychological processes kick in, and these have now been very well researched. There is 200, 300, 400 articles out there, and what I've done in my book is to condense all this social, psychological, social anthropological research into 5 main defenses, so to speak, that are operating in us to keep the climate threat and the climate science at bay.
And so can you take us through these? What are the reactions that go through someone's mind? And this is, somebody who may not have personally felt touched by this issue, because as you point out in your book, when there is what you call personified risk, then there's a different response.
Yeah, I think the first defense or the first barrier that climate messengers have to cope with or fall prey to is the distance barrier, because climate has been portrayed and is perceived as a distant issue. It's distant in time. We talk about the year 2100 or 2050, which is way beyond most people's time horizon. We also have heard a lot about melting Arctic ice, drowning polar bears. There are cyclones in the Pacific and floods in Bangladesh, but it's always somewhere else, and it's far from me. And then thirdly, it's its victims, so to speak, are people that I don't know. They live in these faraway places. I don't know anybody who knows them. And the larger the social distance, the less social empathy we tend to have. And fourthly, it's distant in terms of responsibility, in the sense that the international negotiators and the international politicians and the national politicians, they are the ones that should do something about this. But I don't know them, I have no influence on them, and thus the actions is beyond my scope of influence. So the distancing in terms of time, space, social relations and responsibility makes the climate issue less urgent to us.
And so what happens when somebody who isn't convinced that climate change is real is presented with overwhelming evidence? I mean, as a journalist, I'm very interested in this question. Whenever there are new studies that point to how our species, various species, animal species are disappearing faster than ever, they're predicted to, the forests are dying, and so many pieces of evidence. Our glaciers are literally melting, and the hope is that, well, if only we present enough evidence, at some point there'll be a tipping point and people will accept that this is real. But that's not the right approach, is it?
Unfortunately not. If that approach had worked, then we would have changed our course a few decades ago. The problems are several when it comes to presenting all those facts to humans. The first is that it's often using a framing, so to speak, of doom or a catastrophe, and this induces fear and guilt in people, because we're told that we're creating this through a lifestyle. But I like to feel okay with myself, and the more catastrophe and doom I hear about, the less I would want to listen to that messenger telling me all these things. So I start to avoid the message, and I start to avoid the messengers. So doom has this paradoxical effect that it makes people turn off their engagement, not on. And part of the reason for that is also that our lifestyles, as they have developed during the 20th century, are based on fossil fuels. We drive cars, we have planes, we eat meat, we have buildings, we heat with fossil fuels. And since we all live off this oil and gas, and now we know that it's not as good to do that, or we're criticized for it, then we get into a state of psychological dissonance because I do one thing and I know I should do something else. And this creates a kind of internal uncomfortable state that I have to do something about if I want to feel good about myself. And luckily, or not surprisingly, the human brain is good at coming up with self-justifications. So we make all kinds of excuses, saying, for instance, well, you know, it's not really my emissions, it's my neighbor's because he has a bigger SUV than me, or it's not us, it's China, or it's not us, it's the Middle East, or it's not me, it's the petroleum companies. So I can try to reduce my dissonance by explaining to myself that it's not really about my lifestyle. Or I could also try to doubt the whole message. If I give ear to those who say, well, you know, it hasn't warmed since 1998, for instance, then by disbelieving or discrediting the message, I can get rid of the dissonance too. And this is what I call the demand side of climate disbelief. There's been a huge misinformation campaign with, it's well-oiled, well-funded, and very loud. So it's been a supply side of misinformation. But the surprising part is why people want to disbelieve climate science. Why is it an easy sell? What is the demand, so to speak, for the denial?
You know, some
and
of...
Yeah?
Go finish your sentence, yes.
Yeah, and this is the dissonance part, because if I disbelieve climate science, then I start to feel better about my lifestyle.
Right. Some of this is reminding me of the vaccination wars in the United States, so that there are many well-educated Americans who are very skeptical of the safety of vaccines. And there was a study that found that when people who were skeptical of vaccines were given evidence, the more evidence that they got of the safety of vaccines, the more they dug their heels in and actually believed that vaccines were dangerous. Is that the similar dynamic to what's playing out on the climate change front?
You're right on the spot there. We see the exact same patterns when it comes to applying what we call our self-values or identity to these facts. The trouble with climate science is that it says we need to regulate carbon emissions, and the best way to do this is to tax them. But if my ideological self, my values, say that the market should be as free as possible, and the government should do as little as possible, and taxes is really a way of stealing, then since I don't like the climate policy solutions, I will use my values and to guide me how to undermine or reinterpret the facts of climate science. So since I don't like the solutions, I'll kill the science instead. And this is what we call motivated reasoning. So we've seen that, for instance, in the case of climate science, if you hold conservative values, you tend to get it wrong. The more science intelligence you have, the more you use your knowledge and interpretive powers to explain away the science. While if you're a liberal, the more science and knowledge you have, the more right you get it.
Interesting. So staying on the vaccination issue for a second, there was a Canadian mother of 7 who was very skeptical of vaccinations. But when her 7 children developed whooping cough, for which there is a vaccine, she changed her tune. The Washington Post reported this, and she's really come round on the importance of vaccines. And is that similar to what happens when we see, for example, American farmers whose livelihoods are directly impacted by climate change? They have seen, weather patterns changing personally over the years that directly impact their livelihoods. And now we're seeing, for example, in Republican states, there's growing awareness and acceptance of the reality of climate change because of people taking, realizing that they are personally impacted.
You're right there as well, because if you personally experience climate change, that breaks down a lot of the barriers. First of all, the distance barrier that I was talking about. Suddenly, it's not something abstract far into the future. It's here and now, and it's impacting me, not just other people I heard about. So that might really help. But sometimes even that doesn't help. Sometimes having a superstorm like Sandy hit through New York, or the Katrina and drought, still humans have this amazing capacity to both know something and then live as if you do not know something at the same time. So rather than changing their values and policy priorities, they prefer to rebuild their house or drill a deeper well or just go on with their life and not questioning what's happening, or maybe saying it's an act of God, there's nothing I can do about it anyway. So this is the denial mechanism we all have access to. We can easily both know something and then live as if we do not know at the same time.
I have to say, this whole conversation is also reminding me about the conversations around police violence in Black communities. There was one white man in New York, a longtime supporter of the NYPD, but who supported this police institution. When he became the victim of police violence because he was carrying a knife that the police said was illegal, totally changed his tune and has become a critic of police violence and is much more inclined to believe African Americans who are directly victims of police violence. And so it's really interesting. On the issue of climate change, of course, the realization that climate change is real because it's affecting us personally may be coming too late, right? And that's the real danger.
That is a real danger, and therefore I think we should stop waiting for the climate effects to be so near that they will finally convince a majority by its kind of a massive effect. Rather, I think we should go towards climate communications that will actually go with the flow of human nature and not against it by either just pushing the facts or calling the deniers stupid or ignorant, which we do. And I've also explored in my book the solutions that we know actually work and how we can shift from this kind of negative moralizing, doom prophesying strategy to a more constructive one.
So let's talk about that, because I think that's the most important part of this conversation, particularly among our audience who are likely to be much more believing of the science of climate change and inclined to actually do something about it, and who might encounter every day in their lives climate change denialists. How can ordinary people, and of course I'm also asking you this personally as a journalist, in our one-on-one conversations, and when we encounter denialists, have conversations that where if we actually want to change their minds, can do it in a way that does change their minds rather than having them dig in. I mean, and I should say sometimes many liberals, and I've been guilty of this as well, sometimes simply want to make a point and feel that we are right and feel that we are, morally superior, but then we end up alienating the very person that we need to convince.
Absolutely. So rather than taking the high seat or holier than thou position, many have done, what we should do is to move towards working through social networks, and that is creating a sense of community where we live, that this community is actually caring. So rather than big reports and big discussions about who is right, we just move into action and bring others with us. We act as social citizens and not just as all-knowing individuals. So let me give a few examples. What does it mean to work through the power of social networks? It has to do with applying what we call social norms, social media, and social relations. So if, for instance, one house in a neighborhood gets rooftop solar, then the likelihood of the other houses just close to it also getting a rooftop solar on them is way higher. So it seems that rooftop solar, for instance, is contagious. People notice it and they want to do the same thing. And we've seen the same with electric cars in Norway, because the government gave some import tax cuts for them, and so if there is one street with a car of like say a Nissan Leaf or a Tesla, then suddenly all the neighbors want one as well. And this has been very well documented, for instance, by some research I report in the book done by Professor Bob Cialdini, who put up a study where he made 4 different groups of households. So he asked them to conserve energy, but he gave them different reasons to do so. So the first group were asked to conserve power for the sake of sustainability and the planet, because it's good. The second group were told they should conserve power for future generations, their children, their grandchildren, etc. The third group were asked to conserve power because it's profitable, it cuts their power bill, so you get an economic benefit. And the fourth group were simply told how much they were using compared to their neighbors. And in this case, when you get feedback on that, over time, the consistent result was that it was those who were compared with their neighbors that had the greatest reduction. So bringing the science into where we live in a visible way makes it much more real. It kills the distance barrier, it makes it personal, and it shows the solutions part of it.
And that's a really interesting, just for a moment to interject here, that's a really interesting result, because, often political activists want to make it clear that personal change in our lifestyles is just one small step, and that shouldn't ever be seen as a substitute for political activism and organizing. But what you're saying is that those small steps of driving an electric car or putting solar panels on your roof can actually have a different kind of a ripple impact than we think it might. Not just personally reducing our own footprint, but actually sort of spreading that meme far and wide.
Absolutely, and that's what we call the social norms. One more example is, I like to highlight, is called the Green Sports Alliance, because what they're doing is taking very popular events such as baseball, soccer, football, ice hockey, even car racing, and then greening the events and letting the sports stars themselves say a few words about what their green values. And this then immediately changes the messenger from somebody who's far away, a kind of lab-coated egghead scientist type, to somebody that people will aspire to be like. And these ripples effects, both from your neighbors and from visible messengers that you admire, are very, very powerful. We know that from evolutionary and social psychology.
So what about going beyond that? What else can people do, especially in conversations around climate change?
So in conversations, the conversations we had so far has mainly been dominated by, if we don't change our ways now, then the climate will go to hell, so to speak, or the planet will burn. And this is what we call the doom framing. And also it puts a moral urgency to it. So you have to change your ways right now. But these frames backfire, as I said earlier. So rather than applying the doom frame, we can apply 3 other frames. I want to mention health, because climate is really about health issue. It is with increasing CO2 levels, it increases pollen immediately. It also, so allergies, asthmas, heat-related stresses, heat strokes, and even heat-related violence go way up. So we could talk about what's bothering us today with ticks, with all these things, because if you frame climate as a health issue, then you bring it way up there in the highest policy priorities. Typically, if you ask people in America to prioritize different topics, climate comes out like 14 out of 15.
Wow.
And on top is always the economy, jobs, health, education, these kind of things. So that's why if you align climate with our health concerns, then it gets a higher priority. And it seems the White House is learning this right now, since they're doing a climate change and health summit to take place in the White House. And I also think journalists have been kind of lazy in the sense that they've just reused and overused that doom framing. Some studies of journalism show that more than 80% of all news articles written about the climate issue has been by applying the doom and the catastrophe frame. And less than 2% have applied opportunity frame. So the second frame I want to talk about is the insurance frame. Because if you describe climate as an insurance issue in the same way that we have institutionalized fire and theft insurance, or even a defense. A defense is really a security insurance that you will have some security in the future. We pay something today in order to have risk management
At least it's
into the
supposed to
future.
be, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But that's so if we could do the same thing with climate, it's just kind of plain common sense. It's prudent. It's reasonable to pay a little bit of our incomes in terms of a climate insurance, in the same way that we pay up to 3% for fire and theft insurance. And this is a very bipartisan approach, because this has to do with just handling risk management.
And does doing that sort of normalize the fact that we are in a changing climate?
It does, and it also helps us institutionalize it. So it's not something that you have to remember each day. Like, you don't have to remember, you don't think too much each day about the fire issue, do you? So it just becomes a part of our political and societal structure that we do set aside a little bit to mitigate and adapt to the rising changes.
So talking about climate change in terms of adaptation and transitioning to a different kind of economy is a sort of a more hopeful frame within which to talk about it?
Absolutely. And now you're bringing into the third framing. The first was health, the second is insurance, and the third is opportunities. Because the transition of our energy system is really full of boundless opportunities. There will be thousands of $billions invested in the energy system over the coming decades. And these opportunities in distributed generation, the smart grids, particularly solar and wind, of course, will inevitably transform the energy structure of our economy. To American business, it's really a question of, do you want to be upfront of this wave of innovation, or do you want to be kind of pulled through it and lose out, like Kodak and maybe the horse carriage producers were, by the technological innovation that's coming? So we see a huge wave of energy innovation coming, and the question is, what do we want to, what should be our position, our role in this?
So finally, Per Espen, in your book, what we think about when we try not to think about global warming toward a new psychology of climate action, I think it's important for us to talk about the fact that it does get so overwhelming sometimes for those who have accepted that this is a real thing and a real phenomenon that is jeopardizing the future of the species, of the human species, that there can be a debilitating type of depression around the calamity of climate change that can really, make people sort of spiral. I mean, I struggle with it a lot. I find myself late at night thinking about it, particularly for people who have kids. How important is it for us to address that? You're a psychologist, so I thought it would be important also to ask you about depression around climate change.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up, because in addition to all the barriers and all the doing we have to do, we also have to come into our being. And if you really connect with this issue, as you say, on a deep level, many of us get into touch or feel a great grief, because it could be anger, it could be grief, it's depression, it's a kind of mix of these things. What are we humans that are kind of so self-destructive that we're putting these huge changes into motion without knowing what we're doing, and the sadness of the species disappearing, the sadness of the forests burning, and all these things. Sometimes it just feels futile. Whatever I do, it's like, nothing comes out of it. And I think, first, the more sensitive we are, the more in touch we really get with this great grief, and it really flows through our bodies. And then on top of this, we have a culture where you're supposed to be positive and think optimistic and be happy all the time. And so it's difficult to find other people to really share this deep feeling with as well. And it's difficult to stand up for your depression, so to speak. But this is something I think we have to do, because if we really let ourselves dwell in this dark side of it, and let the sadness move through us, maybe not identifying with it, but letting it really speak to you, then on the other side of this mourning, somehow our hearts seem to open up again. And this numbing that we're subjected to with the consumer culture and the high speed and our dissonance and all these things, that eventually breaks open, and we are open to a deeper kind of caring, a deeper contact with what's still living and the amazing beauty of life, no matter what. So by going deeper into the grief, and the despair, we actually could come out with a much more grounded motivation, a more grounded hope. And this process is something I write about in the third part of the book.
So instead of pushing away the depression and trying not to think about it, you're saying channel it positively, accept it, and maybe find ways to even share it?
Yeah, and express it and dwell with it, and don't be too impatient with it, because it needs to take its time. I mean, rushing into action too quickly only makes us maybe confront and fight and raise more resistance. As we push, the resistance is pushing back. But if we really take our time to let this dark sadness flow through us, then eventually when we do act, it is not with a kind of impatient anger or a type of over excited pushing that makes our actions flow further out, further ripple, so to speak, from our actions.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today for this fascinating conversation that I hope will have some ripple effect throughout. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great being with you.
My guest is Per Espen Stoknes. He's a Norwegian psychologist specializing in climate and environmental strategies, economic psychology, and energy systems. And he's the author of the new book, What We Think About When We Try Not to Think About Global Warming, Toward a New Psychology of Climate Action. That does it for today's program. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com, and our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kohatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.